it's a disaster what has happened on Joe's podcast, politically and culturally. He's got the biggest platform on planet Earth, or nearly so. And I think he's done an immense amount of harm to our national conversation, our political conversation. When you have a platform like Joe has, you have a responsibility to not just lay yourself open and your audience open to a fire hose of bullshit and half-truth and lies, and that acts like a bug light for maniacs.
And of course, he has become somewhat of a sycophant to these billionaires, has Elon on, Peter Thiel on, Mark Andreessen and others, just glazes them and doesn't, push back on anything they're saying. Hi everyone, JJ here. Welcome back to the Johnston Lounge. Well, today this clip from the TRIGGERnometry podcast caught my eye. It's Sam Harris criticizing Joe Rogan, or rather Joe Rogan's platform and how he deals with the guests on there, who he has on and what he says or doesn't say. These softball kind of interviews. And Sam Harris has a lot to say. He has history with Joe. And I have to say, I don't agree with what Sam Harris says sometimes. From what I've seen, I actually don't know what he thinks about most things. I don't really follow him, but this was interesting. So let's get straight into it and I'll react to it.
Yeah, well, I just think the crater we're talking about is bigger than I think you think it is, and some of your friends are in it.
Tell me more.
So, I mean, Rogan is implicated in all of this in a way and Rogan, I've considered Rogan a friend for years. But we're sort of out of touch now. And I think there's probably a reason for that. I mean, he's like, specifically, he has not answered my texts. I tried to give him some,
being ghosted by Joe Rogan for a reason, political reasons, it seems. Also, I'd just like to note that Sam Harris has been a friend of Elon Musk and has heavily criticized him for taking this far-right turn, incrementally, and they're not friends anymore either. So Sam Harris has, I think, been quite sensible in the way that he's been thinking. He didn't take that far-right turn with the rest of them, or how Joe Rogan glazes people, had Trump on there, and no difficult questions, even with his tens of millions of audience that he has there, which Sam does talk about.
Knowing that I was going to have to comment publicly about some of the interviews he's done and I think how irresponsible he's been with his platform, I reached out to him by text and he hasn't responded to those texts. So perhaps my text got lost in the mail, but usually he's pretty good on his text. So, and I'm not sure, honestly, I'm conflicted around the ethics of all of this. I mean, I feel terrible talking about Joe, and yet he's got the biggest platform on planet Earth, or nearly so. And I think he's done an immense amount of harm to our national conversation, our political conversation.
I agree with that too. I do agree with what he says in this about Joe and his platform, not using it the way that a lot of people think that he should. He can do what he wants, of course, it's his show, but if you have the biggest podcast, the biggest platform in the world, shouldn't you be more thoughtful about who you have on and what you say, or pushing back at least?
So I couldn't have done, you guys were just on his podcast. I watched that. I couldn't have had the conversation you had with him there because I would have had to have said this. And presumably he wouldn't have liked it, and there's a lot to talk about.
Whenever somebody has said something that Joe doesn't like, it kind of flies off the handle, does push back, but it's, he just doesn't actually let people have a different opinion. It's either agree with him or you won't be invited back.
I thought the interview he had with Trump was incredibly consequential and incredibly irresponsible, right? I mean, he didn't ask a single difficult question of Trump and just helped midwife his lies. I mean, among which was the 2020 election was stolen lie, right? I mean, that's a shattering lie for a former president to have told in our society, and to have half the society believe it. It's a perpetual invitation to violence. It gave us the violence of January 6th. Things could have been a lot worse, etc. if you have the biggest platform on earth, you can't just have the kind of conversation that Joe had with Trump, and then open the door to everyone else to have their version of that irresponsible conversation.
That's right. Now, this Rogan sphere that he could be talking about there, well, not just that, there are a lot of people who will parrot his opinion. It will just get out there, and Joe does know this. And so with the history of Trump, I mean, he was definitely a supporter. As I've said, I've done videos about Joe Rogan and Theo Von. They've got big podcasts, both of them. So it is millions and millions of people, but they're really softball, and people like going on there to say whatever they want because they know they're not get any pushback. The tech billionaires like Elon and others, Trump, he's too afraid to have Gavin Newsom on there, for instance. I've made a video about that as well. He just won't because he knows that he would just get trampled on in any kind of debate there, because he rails against California, moved to Texas, but he won't have the Californian governor on to talk about it.
So many people think that this was the 2024 was the podcast election. I agree it was the podcast election, but what it was many people following Joe's lead in being completely irresponsible with how they use their platform. And to be specific there, I'm not saying you shouldn't talk to certain people. Joe can talk to anyone he wants to, right? I mean, I think there are certain people you probably shouldn't talk to, but there are certain people that if you're going to talk to them, given that you have a big platform, literally tens of millions of people in Joe's case, you have a responsibility to do more than just establish good vibes with them and make them seem normal, especially if they're not normal, and especially if they're trafficking in lies and half-truths that are going to delude a significant percentage of your audience.
I think part of the problem is here that Joe actually swallows these lies, conspiracy theories, and what have you.
Deluding you as the host because you haven't done your homework. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, his conversation with Daryl Cooper, completely irresponsible, right? I mean, we're living in an age of, Daryl Cooper is a fake historian who's trafficking in David Irving's lies about the Holocaust, right? He bounces from Tucker's podcast to Joe's podcast. On those two podcasts alone, he gets a larger audience, perhaps than any real historian ever has had in the history of history, right?
That's a good point. There'll be some scientists and some people who actually know what they're talking about, historians who he just won't have on there, but he traffics in these lies and BS, right? Somebody who has conspiracy theories, we're quite happy to have those people on.
I mean, it has to be over 50 million people who saw those two interviews combined.
His Rogan episode didn't do very well.
Yeah.
Between Joe and Tucker.
So look, you got to separate Tucker from Joe. It's a completely different conversation.
Well, it's not a completely different conversation. In fact, you could argue that Joe's was worse because Joe's happened after Tucker. There was a mess to clean up, which Joe, rather than clean up that mess, he basically, with his imprimatur as the host who knew everything about Daryl Cooper, who'd done all the homework and listened to 30 hours of Cooper's podcast on the matter, he could sign a blank check morally, assuring his audience that Cooper's a good guy, not an anti-Semite. All of this is good faith, and that the thing he just had said on Tucker, there's nothing wrong with it. It's all just a tempest in a teapot. And people are lying, besmirching him, and it's just libtard hysterics who are having a bad reaction to the truth getting out on some level. And he's done it with RFK Jr. He's done it with all kinds of maniacs, right? I mean, these are people who are, in many cases, liars. Some of them are probably mentally ill, right? Some of them just have character defects where they just love to touch find me a third rail and I'm going to touch it. No matter how combustible our society is, no matter how little I know, I'm just going to keep touching the button to see what goes off.
It reminds me of not long ago when one of his comedian friends was on there and was making fun of Joe for calling him Mr. Scientist, and he got really angry at that. If he's going to glaze people, he should actually show the other side, but he doesn't want to do that. He'd rather just have, as Sam said here, just good vibes no matter what the person is saying, even if they're a Holocaust denier.
Dave Smith, again, another, Dave Smith is not a morally sane voice about the war in Gaza. Right now, he is the person he is because of what Joe has made him. Right, and that debate with Douglas, I've commented on with Douglas about what I thought went wrong there, but all of this has created immense harm in our culture. Right, we're all in the business of building culture. Culture is the operating system of our society. Right, I mean, everything we care about is a matter of culture working better and better or worse and worse.
Okay, so I think that this is right what he's saying here. It's all culture, right? What I'm doing here, creating culture, not in a grandiose sense, but it is part of it. People can criticize YouTube videos, Spotify videos, and different people's podcasts, but it is all part of the culture, and it does matter, especially on the politics side of things. It's not just words, as we've seen over the past few years. These things have consequences, political consequences, real world consequences, whatever you choose to focus on there. But Joe Rogan did have a part of that. Theo Von did have a part in that, although they don't take any responsibility. But Trump actually thanked Joe Rogan for helping him get elected, and he was a supporter. He should own that. He's been pulling back from that, sort of criticizing ICE, what they're doing, but he didn't ask any difficult questions. And of course, politicians are going to go mostly on programs that are going to glaze them or just let them speak without any kind of pushback whatsoever. Joe Rogan is the perfect platform for that. And it's the biggest in the world, even if it's not number one anymore. I mean, it is on Spotify because of the deal there. It pretty much always is every week, but still big worldwide, not just in the US.
Whether we can solve any of the collective action problems we need to solve, whether our species survives is entirely a story, apart from an asteroid impact, it's entirely a story of whether we can sort our culture out enough so as not to annihilate ourselves. And you literally have people doubting whether the Holocaust was even a thing in the context of the greatest explosion of anti-Semitism we have seen in our lifetime. In the middle of a very clear clash between aspiring Islamist theocracy globally and the West, and Israel being the tip of the spear of all of that, massive moral confusion being spread in our society around that, quite consequentially so. And Joe is doing as much as anybody to spread that confusion.
Yeah, for sure. And we've got others too, like Nick Fuentes, the gropers, who are gaining in popularity and being magnified. The scandal this week on X, which I haven't made a video about yet, foreign actors who are on X pretending that they're in the US, but they're somewhere else. And some of these are big MAGA accounts. So it's like a false sense of how popular this stuff is. And the question about who's doing it, there have been rumors about this for years, but Elon must have known because he must have seen some of those accounts. He's got ex-God mode, right? So no matter what he says, he has to wonder if he did that on purpose to destabilize Trump. I don't know. They're all anon accounts, right? And I'm not against anonymous accounts on the internet. There's sometimes a reason for it. But there are a lot of people that are amplifying things, and Elon is using his megaphone platform to amplify conspiracy theories. So it's really important that these big podcasters like Joe Rogan actually get in there and ask proper questions. Like Sam is saying, it's pretty irresponsible to have maniacs on there, perpetuating conspiracy theories all the time.
I think Joe is a good guy. I don't think he wants to harm anybody. I would not say the same about Tucker Carlson. I think they're completely different types of people. But it's a disaster what has happened on Joe's podcast, politically and culturally. Yeah, he's done thousands of podcasts. Thousands of them are great, right? But his approach to this, he's taken absolutely no responsibility as a journalist or as an intellectual or as a historian or as a scientist, because he doesn't view himself as a journalist or an intellectual or historian as a scientist. He's a comic, and he's just shooting the shit with people, and he's just exploring his interests, and great. It's Joe Rogan University. But he has to recognize that he's doing more than that. He's doing more than that just by virtue of having the audience that he has.
And wouldn't it be great if Sam actually went on Joe's podcast now and said all this, actually had this conversation? Joe would not like it. There would be conflict, but it would be entertaining, and it would be informative for his audience as well. Could Joe push back on this, explain his way of thinking about this in front of Sam? He might react to this if he sees it. He might be, the way that he reacted to Mark Maron and others who were criticizing the Rogan Sphere comics and what they were doing, that it was hack now, what they were doing, just being mean to people, punching down, all that stuff that's been playing out. And I've made videos about that too. But it would be great if Sam Harris was able to go on and had like a 3-hour conversation with Joe about this. It would be good.
But he's also doing more than that because he has this taste for conspiracy theories. He's got this taste for contrarian and anti-establishment views and the debunking of the elites, right? He's bought into that side. Like the scales are not just balanced in a truly open-minded and kind of intellectually disinterested way. No, he's got an appetite for the false flag operation, right? Like if there's something, if the non-standard view can be spun at all, he wants to hear about it. And that acts like a bug light for maniacs. Right? I mean, then you just get these, there's an endless number of people who seem to have the right credentials, and many people who don't obviously have the right credentials, like Dave Smith, but you can get an endless number of people with PhDs or MDs or whatever the requisite degree is, who are crazy. Right?
It's true. Yeah, it's true. If you've got a PhD, it doesn't mean that you're not crazy at the same time. But I do get what he's saying here and questioning things. I mean, some people say, I know Carl Kalinske has said this on his podcast, that Joe used to be more, curious, but he went down a certain road, and he agrees with some of these things like Trump and MAGA and all of that stuff. And so he isn't as curious. He doesn't really want to find out the truth. He just wants to go in a certain direction. And of course, he has become somewhat of a sycophant to these billionaires, has Elon on, Peter Thiel on, Mark Andreessen and others, just glazes them and doesn't, push back on anything they're saying. He's just become a complete sycophant. And maybe he's on speed dial with some of these top administration figures as well. He's got too close to power and not questioning it. He's not helping. He's actually harming the culture, I think. I agree.
Right? Or just terrible people, right? When you have a platform like Joe has, you have a responsibility to not just lay yourself open and your audience open to a fire hose of bullshit and half-truth and lies.
Okay, so what do you think about this? I'd love to know what you think. Do you think that Sam Harris is right here about Joe Rogan? Would you like to see him go on Joe Rogan's show? And no, I would, to push back a little bit so they could have some sort of debate. Even if Joe gets a bit angry, it would be entertaining. It would be good. I think there's some valid criticism here, and I've said this in many videos now, but let me know what you think about this. I would really like to know in the comments on Spotify or on YouTube. Comments in both places. Do let me know. And right now I'm going to put a related video on screen on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, and also a subscribe link. Do follow over on Spotify if you use that as well. And thanks for watching this one, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.